The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 9th and 10th chapters. Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You receive without payment, give without payment. The Gospel of the Lord. If you have spent any amount of time in Bay City on the 4th of July weekend, you know what a crowd looks like. It's all these people come from all over the country to see our fireworks for 3 days, every night. And out there on the fields and in the grass and in the parking areas all around, there are just crowds and crowds of people. They do really well as they come together because they come one person at a time. But when it's time to go home, the crowds look harassed and helpless. Because somehow they forgot that everyone leaving at the same time out of a very small space will be a difficult thing to do. If you've been here for the St. Patrick's Day race, you've seen the crowd. It's the one that's gathered downtown in order to run through the streets of Bay City for about half an hour or so. Crowds are a normal thing in our community. Crowds are a gathering place where people come together. Crowds can be good or crowds can be bad. Oftentimes it depends upon who is leading the crowd. And sometimes when things go awry in the crowd, people will do things that they would not as individuals normally have done. We've seen it at sporting events where somebody just gets out of line and you're kind of like, wow, I didn't realize so-and-so did that kind of stuff. And the answer is they normally wouldn't. But all of a sudden, in the crowd, things went a little awry. Sometimes crowds work for good, and sometimes crowds, well, they turn into mobs, and then it's not so good. We've seen a lot of crowds on TV these days. Crowds in cities protesting, sometimes violent, sometimes peaceful, all sort of frustrated about a systemic racist community in which they live and in which the world in which they operate. And so they express their anger. The crowds that have gathered in Bay City, and some of you are among them, I saw that, were a peaceful crowd who wanted to exhibit to the world that they were dissatisfied with the way that some people were treated on the basis of the color of their skin. Crowds can be good, crowds can be bad. And God knows about crowds. Crowds are not a new phenomenon. It's not like we suddenly invented the crowd. Crowds have been around for a long time. When the people of Israel were stuck in Egypt, they turned into quite a crowd. They had grown pretty numerous, pretty sizable. They'd grown so sizable and numerous that Pharaoh was nervous that the Israelites would take over. And so rather than treating them well, as they had been for several hundred years, he decided to enslave them, to turn them into workforces for himself. Now God saw this crowd. He heard this crowd cry out to him. They were a crowd that was rather angry and perhaps wanted to do something about their situation, but it was difficult to do that. And so God decided that God would have to act on their behalf, and God sends Moses to rescue the crowd. And as God brought the crowd out from Egypt and brought them through the sea and brought them to Mount Sinai, they were not always a positive crowd. If you read the story, they grumbled, the water was bad, the food was no good. It was not a pleasant group. But when they got to Mount Sinai, God converted the crowd into a community. God gave them clear instructions about how they were to live with one another and who God was for them and who they would be for God. He declared them
a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a community of faithful people who would bear witness to the world of what it was like for a people to live with this God and to operate together. The crowd turned into community, and the community turned into what we know as the people of Israel, a sign of God's presence in the midst of the world for whoever wished to see it. Jesus knew about crowds. They followed him hither and yon, always looking for something from him. His preaching attracted many to come and be around him. But as Jesus looked at them, he saw them as needy. They were harassed and helpless. They were put down. And of course they would be. They were living under the Roman government. And the Roman government enforced the peace of Rome in pretty forceful ways. They had public crucifixions to remind you who was in charge and who was not. And if you stepped out of line, there wasn't a lot of questions about what they were going to do. They would take you down. Jesus saw them as harassed and helpless. He looked at that crowd and he felt compassion for them. He felt their need. And so he responded. He responded by inviting some others to work with him, to turn the crowd into community, to bring his love, his mercy, his grace to this gathered people that were still looking for some leadership. And through him and through the disciples that followed and the apostles that carried it forth and through the church that moved it on, the crowd becomes the church, the witnessing body to the love of God for all the world. The crowd, the one through whom Jesus operates, is a group of people working together for the common good of all, doing so because we have received the good things from God who has compassion for us. For deep down, what Jesus knows the crowd needs is not to get rid of Rome, but to be recognized as beloved children of God, to be acknowledged as a valuable person in community, in society, to know that they count, that they matter, that each and every one of them as individuals and as a group belong to God. And through them, through us, God will make God's witness known. The crowds will gather, but who will they follow? And if we choose to follow Jesus, then the crowd can become a force for good, for God's good, in God's work.